All right, good afternoon. Today we are going to tackle the rhyme of the ancient mariner. And you may or may not have this sheet in front of you right now. Some terms you should know. If you don't catch any as I go through them, look on page 1214 of your textbook. There's a glossary and that further defines these terms. So assonance is a repetition of vowel sounds. I think most people know alliteration really well. Assonance is the same sort of thing but with vowels, and then alliteration is the repetition of the consonants at the beginning of the words, and consonance is the repetition of sounds, especially the consonant sound, at the end of words. So all these first three here have to do with repetition of sounds. And this is very common when we're talking about poetry because we're talking about how the words sound when they're being used together. An allusion, that is a reference to another literary work or something cultural, a reference to another piece of literature, a place, historical event, or something going on in culture. Caesura, that is something that I briefly mentioned when we were looking at Beowulf and epics. It's that pause in the middle of a line. There's a punctuation mark that causes you to stop. And it's not at the end of the line, it's in the middle, so you are able to take a breath there. Dialogue, of course, is just characters talking to each other. Elegy is a mournful poem, often on themes of death. Metaphor is a comparison between two unlike things that is a direct statement. It is not using like or as, whereas simile is a comparison between two unlike things that does use like or as or even sometimes than. Imagery is just when the author selects words that really paint a picture in your mind as you go through, whether it is visual imagery and you can picture the scene, or olfactory imagery where you get a sense of the smells, or auditory imagery where you hear the sound. So that imagery can occur in different ways, but appeals to the senses in some way, shape, or form. Monologue is kind of like these videos I make when one person talks for a single time. Stanza is a group of lines that is set apart in a poem. Personification, we went through that a lot with the seventh man. So it is when an inanimate object is given human qualities. Internal rhyme is rhyme that occurs within the line. So you might be really familiar with rhyme occurring at the ends of the line. Two roads diverged in a wood. I wonder if I can remember the rest of the Robert Frost poem off the top of my head. Anyway, in that first stanza of the Robert Frost poem, would and could and some other word rhyme. It's the ends of the line. Internal rhyme, however, is, you'll see it, I've got a note here, page 629, that'll be coming up soon, where you have the words within the rhyme. With a heavy thump, a lifeless lump. That's an example of that. Let's see. Mood. Mood has to do with atmosphere, and we talked about atmosphere a bit with some of our short stories that we read. So it's just the feeling that you get from the text that you are reading. Epitaph is a short line that's written usually on a gravestone or a monument. And then foreshadowing, I think most people are pretty well familiar with, a little hinting at what is going to come. Not directly saying a monster is going to jump out of the closet, but letting you know that something bad might happen by the words that are chosen. So you're like, uh-oh, something's going to happen. So let me share a little bit of this background here. Samuel Taylor Coleridge is one of the Romantic poets. And so these particular poets are very well known for how they achieve their effect on the reader based on the words chosen. And so that's why we have the alliteration, consonants, assonance, and internal rhyme that we're looking at once again. Like alliteration here, the fair breeze blew, the white foam flew. So we have a repetition of B's and F's. And then consonants A frightful fiend doth close behind. Well, that one's definitely not as good. You'd have to say, a frightful find doth close behind. And we don't talk like that. But perhaps in the late 1700s, early 1800s, their pronunciation might have been different. It might have worked better. And then assonance, the western wave was all aflame. Repetition of that long A sound. So there are some examples of that. Romantic poets also used formal and flowery terms. They like to use the thee, thy, thou, thence, wherefore, alway, twiz. And a lot of times he'll add an eth to words instead of an s to these verbs to create kind of a sound of a medieval or Renaissance ballad, so it sounds even more archaic. In addition to this, Coleridge really tries to journey into the imagination. There's an interesting little story about how he actually wrote this, that, let's see, well, not this one so much, but Kubla Khan, but let me share this with you. He fell asleep after he had read a passage from a work about the founder of the great Mongol dynasty. He woke up, he wrote the lines as fast as he could, and then he didn't remember what he had been thinking, so he never quite finished it. So he got the idea for the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner by a friend talking to him about a dream. And he started with this dream idea, and Coleridge was friends with William Wordsworth. The two of them started talking back and forth and elaborating upon it. Wordsworth suggested that the act that would drive the entire poem should be a crime committed at sea. And so Coleridge thought about that, used his own imagination and this whole dreamlike state, and wrote the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. So be prepared for kind of a weird, creepy poem, definitely imaginary. He may have written it to escape from some of the health problems he was experiencing. He was also surprisingly full of self-doubt, not thinking that he was good enough. He had asthma and rheumatism. He was also taking painkillers quite a bit, so that may have also been part of his weird visions that he had. And he continued to write, though, as long as he could. So let's see. Dreams were the inspiration for many of his great poems. He loved books as a child. Fantasy was an escape for him. He wanted to form a utopian settlement in Pennsylvania. This was talk and action at the time for many romantics. They wanted to create these little havens where they had these communities of people living together. And so a number of them tried it. They didn't necessarily last that long. They might not have had enough funding. They might not have had enough people who could actually do the work that needed to be done for them to survive. So this piece, The Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, is actually from a joint collection of poems by Coleridge and William Wordsworth together. And I talked about the background of it already. So the poem is going to blend this idea of physical punishment and emotional punishment after the crime has been committed. The mariner is trying to redeem himself and escape from isolation. So there's this idea that without people in your life, you have nothing, and that we should be thankful and grateful for everybody that we have in our lives. And there is this idea of interdependence of humanity and nature, that people are supposed to take care of whatever is around them, whether it be their own property and the trees and gardening and that kind of thing, or animals that are within their care. And this need for order and mercy, and then finally this idea of how love can heal a person. So Wordsworth, as he talked with Coleridge about this, came up with the idea that the ship should be navigated homeward by the dead crew. I mean, just imagine a few guys sitting around talking, oh, what should I write about? Well, I heard this guy had this dream, and oh yeah, that's cool, that's really weird, that would make a great poem. You know what would be really cool is if a bunch of dead guys navigate the ship home. Oh yeah. So I mean, they're tossing these ideas around back and forth. And so initially the Rime of the Ancient Mariner was going to be the first in the order of their poems in this collection. I just lost where my mouse is. There it is. But then Wordsworth had said, well, maybe we shouldn't put it first. People might be a little appalled by this mystical, supernatural poem. Let's put it a little later on. Margin notes written in italics were added by Coleridge in 1817, when the poem then was reprinted in another collection, Sibylline Leaves, and definitely read those because they do help explain what is happening throughout the poem. So Coleridge's marriage and health and friendship with Wordsworth all kind of soured around the same time. He moved to Germany, kind of left everybody behind, and continued to write and lecture. So that's kind of the background before we jump into it. So a typical stanza in the poem is going to have 4 iambic lines. That means there's 4 beats in the first and third lines and 3 beats in the second and fourth lines. And these second and fourth lines are rhymed. This is actually a ballad stanza. It was often used in ballads, songs that tell a story, and this is definitely a poem telling a story. The mariner never tells us why his crew went on this journey originally. The focus is more his emotional and psychological and even physical to some extent, that journey as he's coming back, like what has happened to him. So in part 1, pay close attention to the punctuation. We start out with an argument by the narrator, and then we have a wedding guest and the mariner starting a conversation. The mariner actually stops the guest from going into the party. And that's when this story then gets told, because the old mariner is telling the wedding guest this whole story. So let me pull that up right here, and I actually I'll read the argument and then I can play it instead of me reading it, somebody else's voice. So this argument, this is by the narrator then, the speaker persona that Samuel Taylor Coleridge has presented. How a ship having passed the line was driven by storms to the cold country towards the South Pole, and how from thence she made her course to the tropical latitude of the great Pacific Ocean, and of the strange things that befell, and in what manner the ancient mariner came back to his own country. So we have a little bit of background where the ship is going and then where it ends up. Driven by storms to the cold country towards the South Pole. But we don't know exactly where it started from. And then we find out that it's in the Pacific Ocean, not the Atlantic Ocean, which would be closer to Europe, which would be where Coleridge is. So a setting that is kind of exotic in more ways than one. All right, here we go.
The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It is an ancient mariner, and he stoppeth one. By thy long grey beard and glittering eye, now wherefore stopp'st thou me? The bridegroom's doors are opened wide, and I am next of kin. The guests are met, the feast is set, mayst hear the merry din.
Okay, so the ancient mariner stops a guy, one of 3 people who are trying to go in. And the reaction of this guest is, why are you stopping me? The doors are open. I'm next of kin. I'm related to the bridegroom here. I'm supposed to go in. I can hear the celebration. There's going to be this contrast as we go into the poem between the wonderful wedding celebration and the joy there and this dismal, gloomy story that the mariner is telling. So he continues to stop him. and he's kind of creepy. Let's see how this reader does it.
He holds him with his skinny hand. "There was a ship," quoth he. "Hold off, unhand me, grey-beard loon." Eftsoons his hand dropped he. He holds him with his glittering eye. The wedding guest stood still, and listens like a 3 years' child. The mariner hath his will. The wedding guest sat on a stone. He cannot choose but hear. And thus spake on that ancient man, the bright-eyed mariner. The ship was cheered, the harbor cleared. Merrily did we drop below the kirk, below the hill, below the lighthouse top. The sun came up upon the left, out of the sea came he, and he shone bright, and on the right went down into the sea. Higher and higher every day, till over the mast at noon. The wedding guest here beat his breast, for he heard the loud bassoon.
All right, at this point in the poem, we still have an awareness of the guest who is listening. So the mariner has started his tale when the guest said, "Hold off, unhand me, graybeard loon." Immediately, the mariner dropped his hand, but instead of holding with his hand, he looks at him with his glittering eye. And it's like the bridegroom's guest is not able to escape the mariner. There was a ship. The wedding guest stands still and listens like he has no power to leave, like a 3-year child. Like the mariner is holding him. So the wedding guest sits down on a stone and he starts listening to this bright-eyed mariner. So the mariner starts to tell about the ship sailing southward with a good wind and some fair weather. And now there's this section where we're going back to the wedding. The wedding guest beats his breast. He hears the loud bassoon. The bride, now you know how the bride enters the church last when you go to a traditional wedding. So the bride has entered the hall. She's red as a rose, blushing bride. Everybody is happy to see her. There's the minstrelly, again, the bridal music, but the mariner seems to be oblivious of all of this, doesn't hear it, and just keeps going on with his tale.
The bride hath paced into the hall, red as a rose is she. Nodding their heads, before her goes the merry minstrelsy. The wedding guest, he beat his breast, yet he cannot choose but hear. And thus spake on that ancient man, the bright-eyed mariner. And now the storm blast came, and he was tyrannous and strong. He struck with his oar-taking wings, and chased us south along.
All right, so you might be confused right here if you're not paying attention. The storm blast came, so then these he's refer to the storm. So this, once again, is that technique called personification. The storm is as if it's some kind of monstrous being chasing them.
With sloping masts and dipping prow, as who, pursued with yell and blow, still treads the shadow of his foe, and forward bends his head, the ship drove fast, loud roared the blast, and southward, aye, we fled. And now there came both mist and snow, and it grew wondrous cold, and ice, mast high, came floating by, as green as emerald. And through the drifts, the snowy cliffs did send a dismal sheen, nor shapes of men nor beasts we ken, the ice was all between. The ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around. It cracked and growled and roared and howled like noises in a swound.
All right, here is a little technique. I didn't have on the sheet at all, but this phrasing, the ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around, that repetition of a word in these subsequent phrases is called anaphora. And Coleridge does this a couple times. Another time later, he'll do it with water. And so it's supposed to have the effect on the listener of this ice surrounding them. And that you should be able to visualize it because of the repetition here. And so the ship has been driven by a storm toward the South Pole, being surrounded by ice. Kind of gloomy and dismal. An albatross is a seabird, and this is going to play a key role in this next part of the story.
At length did cross an albatross. Thorough the fog it came, as if it had been a Christian soul. We hailed it in God's name. It ate the food it ne'er had eat, and round it flew. The ice did split with a thunder fit. The helmsman steered us through. And a good south wind sprung up behind. The albatross did follow, and every day for food or play came to the mariner's hollow. In mist or cloud, on mast or shroud, it perched for vespers 9, whiles all the night through fog smoke white glimmered the white moonshine.
It doesn't even go all the way to the end there. All right, so this last part of part 1. God save thee, ancient mariner, from the fiends that plague thee thus. Why look'st thou so? With my crossbow I shot the albatross. So this is confusing if you're not paying attention to this little quotation mark here. The guest is saying, God save the ancient mariner from the fiends that plague thee thus. Why look'st thou so? And then this is the reply of the ancient mariner. With my crossbow I shot the albatross. Okay, so this seabird called an albatross came through the snow fog. The men were really happy to see it. They received it with joy and hospitality. They felt like there was life in this desolate area, and they thought it was a bird that was a good omen for them, that meant good things were coming. And it continued to follow the ship as the ship turned northward, and they continued through this fog and the ice. This Vespers 9, if you've ever gone to evening church, they may follow the order of Vespers. It's evening, and so Vespers 9 means the 9 o'clock watch in the evening, not the morning. And so you've got the moonshine here too, so some more imagery. And for whatever reason, the ancient mariner does not like the albatross and decides to shoot him. And that's where this first part ends. So take a look at these questions. If we go back to lines 5 through 8 and look for internal rhyme, and I'm looking in my book since this isn't numbered. So we're going up to here. The bridegroom's doors are open wide, and I am next of king. The guests are met, the feast is set. So right there, that is the line that has internal rhyme, because met rhymes with set. What is personified in lines 41 to 44? So that's going to be where I had stopped and talked about it, the storm blast. Let me see if I can come to it quickly. Right here. The storm blast is being personified. And because it sounds like it's after them, he struck and chased us, tyrannous and strong, it's definitely more ominous. And the readers and that wedding guest should have a greater sense of fear. Repetition in lines 59 to 60. So that was the part that I talked about with the ice. The ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around. So that repetition should definitely make you feel like there's no escape. We're surrounded by ice. How do the sailors treat the albatross? There's a little line here. As if it had been a Christian soul, we hailed it in God's name. Like, they're so happy to see it. They treat it almost like it is a human, like it is a Christian soul. And it ate the food it ne'er had eat. So that means they gave it all kinds of wonderful foods that it had never had before. So they treat it really well. And the crime that the mariner commits, well, that's the crime of killing an innocent animal. It had done nothing wrong, and yet he shoots it, and that's what makes it a crime. He didn't need the meat. He just shot it for no reason whatsoever. And that's where we're going to stop this recording.